Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Valacia, Head of Automotive Advisory at IHS Markit. Today we'll be discussing India's decarbonization goals and the market's EV challenges. We're joined by IHS Markit experts Vijay Subramanian, Director of Global CO2 Compliance, Cost and Powertrain Forecasting, and Suraj Ghosh, Associate Director, Powertrain and Compliance Forecasting. Mike Wall, Executive Director of Automotive Analysis, will be leading our discussion. With that, I'll pass it over to Mike.
Vijay, Suraj, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. The title of our thought leadership piece this month is India's Decarbonization Goals and the EV Conundrum. So with that, start things off, Suraj. What is the conundrum?
Right. First of all, thank you so much, Mike. Getting straight into the conundrum, the big conundrum for the Indian EV situation is that India is currently the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. And it's under huge obligation on the international stage to commit to measures that could reduce its CO2 emissions. And considering the stage of development that India is currently at, its huge energy needs must be met, and the conventional energy sources are positioned to be the most cost effective. So on the supply side, the government wants to swiftly transition to green sources of energy, namely solar and wind mostly. And on the demand side, it's framing policies and regulations for industrial sectors concerned with CO2 reduction targets. So among the several key sectors, automotive sector is one, which is identified as a prime contributor to CO2 into the atmosphere. And the government has introduced and is continuing its policy drafting measures even now, and in an ambition to check CO2 emissions. And one of those key policy measures is focused on the automotive sector and electrification of the automotive sector. So the Indian automotive market is unique in a way that the product requirements are different, and most importantly, the affordability factor is also very different. And given the relatively higher price points of electric vehicles in comparison to ICE-driven vehicles, its adoption needs government intervention in terms of tax breaks or consumer incentivizations. So on the one hand, the government aims to electrify, but on the other hand, the market may not be ready yet. So that is the main conundrum. And so the government must spend on promotion programs, which puts pressure on its fiscal means. We are a developing economy, and there would be a limit to which the government is able to spend on promoting a new technology. So that is the main conundrum, that we want to reduce CO2 emissions from the transport sector, but at the same time, the government's means are limited, in promoting the adoption of cleaner electric vehicles.
That's great, and you sort of answered my next question was why is India so critical in those efforts towards global decarbonization, because of the scope and scale of the emissions that are kind of coming out of the market. But to dig into the second part of your point around EVs, how do you see the Indian EV market evolving and growing out to say 2030?
Yeah. So to answer the first part, as I mentioned earlier, India is the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world, and this is the absolute emission of CO2. But if we look at the per capita CO2 emission, then India falls way below in comparison to some of the other countries, even way smaller than India. So if India's per capita emissions are to grow and reach a level of, say, a China, which is around 3 times that of India, or say USA, which is almost, more than 5 times of India, then the repercussions would be huge. India would become the highest or the largest CO2 emitter in the world if our per capita emissions grow and reach the levels of the developed economies. So in that sense, India's measures for decarbonization become very critical because the whole global CO2 emission scenario would change if India's CO2 emission continues its path on business as usual. And that's the significance of India's strategy for decarbonization. And to the second part of your question, how do we see the EV market grow by say 2030? At IHS Markit and at IHS Markit, our assessments show that in the BAU scenario, with the visibility of government policies on energy and on CO2 regulations, and also the EV promotion schemes that we have, and also looking at the overall customer evolution that has been going on, we think that EVs will capture about 9% of the market by 2030. But also alternatively, we have built two more scenarios apart from the business as usual scenario. So in the first scenario, we assume that the government's policies or promotion schemes would become more stronger, and also the CO2 regulations would become stricter. And at the same time, we assume that parity would be achieved with ICE vehicles in terms of price, range, and convenience. Then the share could go as high as say 15 or 16%. And in the second alternative scenario, on top of all the parameters that we have assumed in the first scenario, if the promotion schemes become huge, say at the level of what China did when they introduced their EV policy, and also our CO2 regulations become very strict, again, say let's say that maybe at the level of Europe or North America, then the share of EV could go as high as 20 to 21% by 2030.
That's great. It's great to know that we're running scenarios like that, offering scenarios to the market, because as you've alluded, you can turn one dial one way or another dial another way, and it can have a vastly different result in terms of EV adoption and certainly other factors in the industry. Let's turn to Vijay. Vijay, thank you as well for joining us for this podcast. First question for you is really, how do you, the regulations which Suraj has kind of run down, and certainly the regulations you've been tracking, how do you see those aligning with India's longer term zero emission goals and net zero goals, I should say?
Thanks, Mike. In terms of the net zero goals for India, the recent commitment of India on COP26 clearly states that they want to achieve net zero by 2070, which is 10 years later from China and 20 years later from Europe and US market. And once again, that too, it's a stringent goal. As mentioned by Suraj, currently India does report CO2 emissions both on the intensity-based metrics and also based on a per capita-based metrics. Depending on how the metric goes, the goal is going to be definitely stringent, especially for India market. And when we come to the transportation sector, which is the third biggest emitting sector as compared to energy or the industrial sector. On the current status, Indian road transport contributes somewhere around 290 megatons of CO2 at the 2020 levels, and to reduce that to zero by 2070, it's a stretched goal, because it's not only the road transport which has got a huge amount of influence in India on the current levels. There are other transports which is transport modes which are there in India, which really requires a huge amount of electrification. Name it heavy duty and name it two-wheelers and those kind of segments as well. But when it comes to the regulation standpoint, currently the Indian regulation has got a mandate to regulate the overall CAFE regulations or the fuel efficiency standards. The 2017 numbers is 130 grams of fleet level of of corporate average CO2 figures. And by 2022, it's on the current regulation goes, it's 113 grams. And if we look at 2030 standpoint, a stretch of 30 to 35% of reduction from the current levels is really required to align with the net zero goals. But in terms of the long range regulatory framework or the targets, India haven't published anything yet as of the moment for 2030 CAFE norms or 2035 CAFE norms. But if you look at other markets, there are commitments against 2035 and 2040 time period to achieve the net zero goals, to align with the net zero goals in this aspect.
Okay, that's great. So we've established there are a lot of goals. there are some very tall goals that are out there. So I guess, Suraj, back to you. How are OEMs gearing up to achieve compliance and to hit these goals? I presume EVs are going to be a key part of this compliance strategy, but how does that manifest itself?
Yeah, right. Yeah, so the CO2 emissions of the light-duty vehicles in India are currently regulated by the corporate average fuel economy norms, as stated by Vijay, and these norms have been in place since April of 2017. So the first phase lasted for it would be over this year, March. So the first phase has not been very strict, and it was certainly not strict enough to force any serious electrification in the Indian automotive industry. So in that sense, the first phase was pretty easy from a compliance point of view, without investing too much on any new technology or any new electrification measures. OEMs mostly could achieve the compliance. But for the second phase, a higher degrees of electrification might be required, and we think that even the second phase is not that strict in comparison to, say, some of the other developed markets like China or Japan or the European markets. Nonetheless, it has become stricter from the first phase, and it will enforce some degree of electrification. But again, the second phase would not be strict enough to force OEMs to introduce BEVs, from a compliance point of view. They can easily achieve compliance by having a good mix of hybrid vehicles, be it the mild hybrids or the strong hybrids, and a good mix of diesel as well. But having said that, BEVs, electric vehicles, will play an important role for some of the OEMs who have exited the diesel space and who do not want to invest into the intermediary step of having to introduce mild hybrids or strong hybrids. For example, Tata Motors is a good example. They have ICs and they have electric vehicles, and they are doing pretty well in terms of their compliance performance. So going forward, what we think is that though the compliance may not be forcing enough for OEMs to introduce BEVs as such, but some of the OEMs will take the lead and will start introducing BEVs, not only from the compliance point of view, but also from taking an advantage of the fact that the legacy market leaders of the Indian auto market are not really serious about the EV space, and they are taking their own time. So that has left some space for new players to come in and introduce electric vehicles. So if we look at the next 5 to 6 years time frame, then I would say that the leadership position of the electric vehicle space would look very different from the leadership positions of what we see today of the IC vehicles.
That's great. That's really interesting. And it is interesting to see how that's evolving. And even as you mentioned, hybrid and some of that hybrid technology serving as something of a transitional technology for some automakers, but not necessarily all automakers. And it just speaks to some of the diversity of strategies within the broader market. I guess to Vijay, just to follow up on that, how does India's decarbonization goals, or how do those goals play into companies' broader ESG strategies and goals, and possibly even impact other areas within the market?
Yeah. In terms of the impact with regards to all these achievements of goal or the decarbonization goals, right? Globally, we have seen impacts in the key markets. When we speak about the ESG angle, the biggest challenge from the ESG specific, especially the E-pillar specific aspects, is not taken seriously in India at the moment. If you look at the entire ESG framework in terms of a sustainable finance reporting, or a framework which really requires the car manufacturers and also the associated suppliers to declare sustainability reporting kind of requirements, is not there currently in India. India is currently setting up a scene to follow other markets like Europe and also US in this aspect, to gather or to assess what kind of framework they really wanted on the ESG space, to assess the tier ones, tier twos, and the OEMs current position and their contribution of their CO2 emissions against the overall net zero goals. And having said that, recent consultation papers being floated from SEBI clearly shows that India has got a clear indication to look into the ESG aspect of each and every particular car manufacturers as well. And now this becomes a global scenario. When we look at a global theme of this, right? Where do we source a part would become crucial. How the part is made would also become crucial, and what kind of CO2 that particular part is emitting would also become crucial when we speak about it in the ESG angle. And I'm really speaking about only the E pillar, not the social and the governance pillar. Social and governance pillar are quite different to that of the decarbonization goals. Yes, India's gearing up to look into the ESG frameworks, and when we look at equivalence of ESMA or equivalence of IFRS, these kind of financial reporting systems are now accompanied with sustainable reporting systems as an additional amendment, and India would follow a similar kind of procedure as well to tackle the tier ones, tier twos, and the finance sector, and also the OEMs from the ESG perspective.
And that's a good point on sort of the global implications as well. So I guess to that point, Vijay, so how are India's decarbonization goals, I guess, aligned with other markets when we think about it from a global perspective?
Yeah, if you look at current COP26 goals, right? Current COP26 goals are quite stretched, but pretty much if you look at the overall goals, it's pretty much a similar kind of fashion which the other markets are disclosing on a national development contribution plans. Like for an instance, India has got an ambition to increase non-fossil energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030, 50% of renewable energy mix by 2030. Those are, and also reduce the carbon emissions by 1 billion tons till 2030. Those are a high level of ambitious goals which India is putting forward. But if you look at 2030 timeframe, it's only 9 years from now. If you think about a business as usual scenario, India is not currently in that kind of a trajectory. But and that's one area where we will see large amount of amendments to the existing regulations, existing policy frameworks, existing financial frameworks, existing disclosure networks. Those kind of elements would change because those needs to change to accommodate or achieve this high level overarching goals of 2030. And we have seen this in the market of Europe and US as well, right? Europe, starting from 2018, European Commission did come up with European Green Deal, which comprises many frameworks, starting from the energy standpoint, finance sector standpoint, sustainable finance standpoint, and also the transportation CO2 reduction standpoint. Each and every framework do speak to each other to achieve the overall net zero goal. Similarly, if you look at US market as well, the recent announcement from on the Biden administration with the changes to the targets have also happened. So, and I anticipate a similar kind of framework adaptation would be there in India, and also changes to the regulation which underpins that framework would also happen to that for the Indian OEMs or the car manufacturers pretty shortly in due course of 1 to 2 years time frame.
Okay. Well, turning back to India specifically, as we close out our conversation, I'll pose this to both of you, just bluntly. Will the country be able to achieve these goals, and are the automakers ready? I guess to start it off, Suraj, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the requirement from the auto industry to to be in alignment with what the country's goals are, the gap is huge actually. So to cover that gap, the auto industry has to make some quick progress, and the transition to electric vehicles has to be very, very quick. But looking at the current situation and looking at all the dynamics, all the parameters that we track and study, it doesn't really suggest that kind of that quick a transition is possible, at least in the first phase. The first phase, I would say, the phase till 2030, when some of the other mature markets phase out ICE developments, internal combustion engine developments, and directly move to cleaner vehicles. But that phase would be slightly slow for India. But after that, I think once we achieve a certain level of electrification, the transition will become quicker. But again, to go hand in hand with the government's goals, the auto industry might be a bit slow, I would say. Seems
fair. Vijay, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I agree with Suraj. In terms of a business as usual scenario, right? Indeed, clearly India is not in a trajectory to achieve net zero on a current state of art. But if India looks back in terms of the levels of electrification growing in the other markets, right, and these cars can be also bought into Indian markets to meet the goals. But if you think about that kind of aspects, yes, the goal becomes achievable. But once again, Indian consumer has got a different kind of dynamics. That kind of dynamics needs to be substituted or amended with additional policy frameworks to make it achievable. But once again, from the target standpoint, there is some kind of cushioning effect which India has got, because their net zero goals comes 20 years later than that of Europe, or 10 years later than that of China. So that gives some kind of buffer. But in terms of policy adaptations and policy amendments, that's the key element which would drive the goal achievement or a different scenario, which is more aligned towards either a 1.5 or a 2 degree C kind of a scenario to meet the Paris agreements. So right now, to answer it shortly, right, on a business as usual, it's not possible. But on a trajectory towards electrification with additional electrification uplifts, yes, it is clearly possible from the road transport perspective.
That's great. Well, Suraj, Ghosh, Vijay, Subramanian, thank you both so much for joining me for this timely discussion on India's decarbonization goals. And I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for joining us today, and we'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt in for our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, please visit ihsmarket.com/auto newsletter.